In this one, I'm looking at the tune Sweet Georgia Brown. This tune fits in well with the series at this point because it combines harmonic aspects that we talked about in the last 3 episodes. Sweet Georgia Brown was written in 1925, and it's probably best known as the theme song for the Harlem Globetrotters. Now, one thing that's interesting about this tune is that it's typically played with a Charleston comping pattern. That rhythm comes from the tune, the Charleston, which was written by James P. Johnson and which was very popular at the time that Sweet Georgia Brown was written. In what I think is the original recording of Sweet Georgia Brown by Ben Burney and the Roosevelt Orchestra, they don't play the Charleston rhythm, but they do play it in the 1949 recording by Brother Bones, which is the one that was adopted by the Harlem Globetrotters. So I don't know if that's when the Charleston rhythm got attached to the tune, but it gives it a very distinctive groove. It's one of those tunes that just seems to have swing feel built into it. And I think that for that reason, even though it's almost 100 years old, it's still a lot of fun to play. So one of our goals in learning specific tunes is to identify harmonic elements that also appear in other tunes. Learning to recognize these common harmonic patterns helps you to see the bigger picture of a tune. Sweet Georgia Brown is a 32-bar tune, and it follows an A-B-A-C form. Melodically, it's pretty simple. A lot of the notes are quarter notes played right on the beat, and there are only 4 spots where a melody note is non-diatonic. Harmonically, the tune begins with a cycle of dominant chords. In the last episode, I explained what a dominant cycle is, and I demonstrated a number of patterns that will help you learn how to improvise over a dominant cycle. To understand any chord progression, it's helpful to work backwards so that you always see where it's going. This tune arrives at the home key center, in this case it's A-flat major, in the 13th bar or the last 4 bars of the first ending. The 4 bars preceding that chord are E-flat dominant 7. E-flat dominant 7 is the 5 chord in A-flat. So this is a very typical 5-to-1 chord progression, although the fact that the 5 chord lasts for 4 bars is less typical. The 4 bars before that are B-flat dominant 7. B-flat 7 is the 5 chord of E-flat, so here we see the cycle of one dominant chord resolving to another dominant chord. In the home key of A-flat, B-flat 7 is the 2 dominant. We could also call it 5 of 5. The 4 bars before that are the first 4 bars of the tune. They extend the cycle again with F dominant 7, which is the 5 chord leading to B-flat. F7 is the 6th dominant chord in the key of A-flat, and we could also call it 5 of 5 of 5. Looking at this cycle of 3 dominant chords, it's easy to see how it could be continued by preceding the F7 chord with C7 and the C7 chord with G7 until you eventually go through all 12 keys. So the shorthand description of the chord progression in the first half of this tune is 6 dominant to 2 dominant to 5 dominant to 1. In the last bar of the first ending, we see a 2-5 that takes us back to 6 dominant. The second half of the tune starts the same way, with F7 moving to B-flat 7. But instead of going to the 5 chord at that point, the tune takes a detour to the relative minor of the key, which is F minor in this case. When we arrive at the F minor key center, we're coming from B-flat dominant. F minor 7 is the 2 chord to B-flat 7 as the 5 chord. They're extracted from the same pool of notes. So the harmonic difference between B-flat dominant and F minor as key centers is subtle. To bring out the difference, I can use an F harmonic minor scale over the F minor key center. As I've talked about previously, that scale contains all the notes of the G minor 7 flat 5 and the C dominant 7 flat 9, so it works well over a minor 2-5. So when looking at Sweet Georgia Brown up to this point, we see a dominant cycle and a modulation to and from the relative major and minor. I've already talked about melodic strategies for improvising on both these harmonic progressions, but there are 2 things in the last 4 bars that are worth talking about. The first happens in the penultimate 2 bars of the form. Here we see 4 dominant chords, descending by half steps, starting with the 1 dominant chord and winding up at the 6th dominant chord. This sets up 2-5-1 as a final resolution to the key of A-flat in the last 2 bars. When chords move chromatically, the dramatic harmonic shift presents a challenge for the improviser. I'm going to suggest 3 ways to deal with these 2 bars. First, looking at the melody, we see that it basically ignores the descending dominant chords. It's all diatonic except for 1 chromatic passing note. So the improviser could do the same thing, simply playing diatonically over the last 4 bars. A second option is to outline the descending chord progression. You can do this by picking any one of the chord tones and simply following the chromatic movement downwards. Or you could play a melodic pattern, transposing it on each chord. Now a third way to approach these 2 bars is to treat them as a minor 2-5. C minor 7 flat 5 is very similar to A flat dominant 7, and since you still wind up on the 6th dominant chord, it sounds perfectly natural and it creates an easier melodic flow than trying to navigate individual chords moving chromatically. This is a good example of something I do with students a lot, figuring out ways to simplify a chord progression. You gotta remember that the melodic contour of your lines counts for at least as much as the harmonic contour. It's not necessary to shift with every single chord, and it sometimes could be counterproductive if it compromises your ability to construct melodic lines that flow naturally. I'm going to demonstrate by playing a couple of choruses, and I'll use the opportunity to share a little insight into the world of the studio musician and how that could be applied to effective practice for the improviser. As a session player, you're on the floor of the recording studio while the producer or the writer or the client are in the booth. They can hear you, but you can't hear them unless they turn on the talkback mic. After a take, there's a period while the people in the booth listen back and discuss what they hear. The musicians on the floor wait to hear whether we're going to do another take or move on. Now, during the waiting period, you might hear them solo your part. In other words, they play back the recording with only your part being heard. Now, that's rarely a good sign. It likely means they heard something wrong with what you played. But this is life under a microscope in the recording studio, and it can be nerve-wracking to hear your flaws revealed so publicly. I suggest that in the practice room you try to hold yourself to the same standard that you would if you were recording, and you practice in a way that exposes your flaws rather than covering them up. Acknowledging and addressing your weaknesses is the quickest path to improvement. One technique that I use to do this is to record myself improvising with a play-along track and then to listen back without the track. That reveals problems with time and tone quality and articulation and the clarity with which my melodic lines express the harmony of the tune. I'm going to let you hear that now. I'll play 2 choruses while I'm listening to the backing tracks, but I'll solo the trumpet part in the first chorus so that you can assess to what degree I'm reliant on the other musicians to make sense of what I play. The last thing I want to talk about on this tune is the ending. One of the challenges facing any group when they're improvising is how to end the tune. It's a weak point for a lot of students. It generally falls to who's ever playing the melody to signal how they want the tune to end. One way to do that is with a tag ending. To tag an ending, you play it 3 times before concluding. The advantage is that once you start the second tag, everybody knows where you're going. One way to tag the ending on this tune is simply to play the last 4 bars as written 3 times and put a button on the end. Another option that's used often with this tune is to slow down on the 3rd tag. You could slow down everything, including the rhythm, or you could keep the pulse the same while extending the chords so that just the harmony slows down. That's what you're going to hear in the next demonstration, where the final 2-5-1 is extended from 2 bars to 8 bars.